So last time we talked about the fact that the English have terrible tastes when it comes to finding new colonies. And in fact, they probably don't have any taste at all. Why? Well, because they're starving. They don't bother to provide for themselves. They're totally focused on finding gold, which inevitably turns out to be fool's gold anyway, and then they all starve to death. Or, okay, my bad. They don't all starve. Only 90% of them starve, which is an improvement, I guess. And to make matters worse, if they want to go out and find sources of food or wells, they are met by hostile Native American tribes. Again, Jamestown itself is situated right smack dab in the middle of Powhatan's confederation. Basically, a loose sort of tribal alliance of multiple tribes. And in total, Powhatan's confederation numbers about 20,000 to 24,000 Native Americans. So that's a very large number, especially when you think about the fact that Powhatan's tribal villages aren't very large. They're mostly small towns, certainly not cities. But you have 24,000 Native Americans against, by the year 1610, only 60 English settlers. And this is actually a pretty good point to bring up these two individuals again. Actually, not these two, but these two. So if you remember from your analysis of the Valladolid debate between Sepulveda and De las Casas, remember that there is this disagreement on how to view Native Americans. And remember that Sepulveda basically views them as inhuman, right? As just expendable resources. Then, on the other hand, if you look at the argument that De las Casas makes, he kind of has this paternalistic view. In other words, this is this view that Native Americans need to be protected. So De las Casas, I suppose he kind of sees himself as being a nice person, as being a good person, but it's certainly not the case that he sees Native Americans as equal, right? He sees them as inferior and in need of protection. So for the most part, if you're looking at how Native Americans are actually viewed in early colonial history, most Europeans kind of fell into one of those two camps. The Sepulveda camp, which basically says that Native Americans are inferior and have to be either driven out or killed. It's harsh, but that's the way it is. That's the way many Europeans actually thought and felt. And then you have the view of De las Casas, where it's this idea that Native Americans are inferior, but that means they need to be protected. So if you're paying attention, there are a few perspectives that are missing. You know, maybe like the idea that Native Americans are people too, and maybe they can think and act independently, and maybe they should be respected as, a fellow human being and not sort of looked down upon, or in the case of Sepulveda, outright killed. One of the common themes of historians who are looking at Native American history is this theme of, quote, the noble savage. And this is a perspective that to a certain extent persists today. In the 1880s, an American historian by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson will write a book called A Century of Dishonor, in which she chronicles the many crimes and atrocities committed against Native Americans. But the tone of that book is not the tone of somebody who sees Native Americans as being equal, right? It's this idea that Native Americans are in need of protection. It's this kind of infantilizing perspective. Kind of like, I don't know, if you have that relative, maybe this grandparent who still thinks of you like you're, 5 or 6 or 2, that's kind of the perspective of this kind of tradition of looking at Native Americans as, quote, noble savages. So there's this idea that before colonization, that Native Americans were good and pure and innocent, and then Europeans come along and corrupt them. Again, there's not a lot of room to talk about Native Americans as basically being their own actors with their own motivations. And that is why I love Powhatan. Okay? Powhatan isn't a rube. He wasn't born yesterday. He is one slick dude. Okay? Don't think of Powhatan as being that really laid back, chill guy who was Pocahontas' dad. He was, by the way. But that's not why I love Powhatan. Powhatan is fascinating because of just how calculating the guy is. Powhatan is actually, we're going to talk about three rags to riches stories. A story of three individuals who kind of rise above their station today: Powhatan, John Smith, and John Rolfe. But Powhatan's rise to power is, in some respects, the most stunning story of them all. So Powhatan began as the leader of a tribal confederation that numbered only about 6 tribes. By the time by the time the English found Jamestown, 6 tribes have grown into 30. This guy was almost like an Algonquin version of Alexander the Great for all practical purposes. I mean, he was really going places. And he managed to conquer all of these different tribes through a combination of, outright force and, in some cases, diplomacy and strategic marriages. So he's a very calculating guy. And when the English settlers arrive in Jamestown, Powhatan is that guy who doesn't so much see a threat as much of an opportunity. He sees English iron weapons, he sees English gunpowder, and what he's thinking is, it'd be nice to have those. So what he tries to do is he tries to put pressure on the English settlers in Jamestown, so they will try to join his tribal confederation. And for modern eyes, that might seem ridiculous, but not to Native American eyes, because you gotta remember that there was no word for being a Native American, during this time period. So from Powhatan's perspective, the English are just another tribe. In some respects, they're smaller than a lot of other tribes in the area. So, for example, Powhatan's confederation consisted of a number of different really unique tribes, and the English just looked like, maybe hairier, hairier people than what was normal in Virginia, but who was he to judge? I mean, there are guns and iron weapons and all kinds of nice things. So Powhatan wants the English to join him. But the English aren't going to do that. And so Powhatan is faced with a problem. He wants the English to join him willingly, but if the English are left to their own devices, they probably won't. So how is he going to deal with that? And the answer is that he tries to cut them off from their food supplies. And he does that rather successfully, by the way. Basically, the fort at Jamestown is besieged. In other words, surrounded by many of Powhatan's tribal allies. Now, you might think, well, at some point, wouldn't the English take that personally? Wouldn't they refuse to join just out of spite if Powhatan is attacking them? Well, they don't know that Powhatan is attacking them. So what Powhatan does is he gets a neighboring tribe called the Paspahegh tribe to basically harass Jamestown. And every time Powhatan kind of comes around and walks around the neighborhood, he asks the settlers how they are, and the settlers are like, we keep getting attacked by all these, Native Americans in the other area. Do you know anything about that? And Powhatan's like, nah, I never do that. Like, we're tight. Yeah, I'll try to have a word with them, and maybe if I help you out, you can help me out and help deal with some of my enemies. So Powhatan is a very I would say a brilliant strategist in some respects. If For those of you who have taken AP Euro, you might remember Machiavelli. If you want to find an example of Machiavellianism, of calculation, you don't have to look at Otto von Bismarck. You can look at Powhatan, baby, because he is just so shrewd and so slick. And he almost succeeded, if not for the injury of this guy. Um, this is probably how John Smith um, appears to some of us in history, because all of you guys have Disney Plus now, and in 1995 there you have the production of the very lackluster Disney animated film Pocahontas. And apparently, John Smith is remembered as this singing, frolicking guy who sounds like Mel Gibson. And that is not who John Smith is at all. Think of John Smith more like this. Because John Smith is another example of people who do very well in the New World, who don't necessarily do well in the Old World. What do I mean by that? Well, John Smith was kind of a jerk. In fact, he was such a jerk, and he was so cantankerous and hard to get along with, that when he arrives in the New World, he arrives in chains. The captain of the passenger ship had already arrested the guy. But John Smith brings a few very specific skills. So Smith is a professional soldier. And when I mean professional soldier, I mean that is all he does. He's served as a mercenary since the age of 16. So his father dies, he leaves home, and then he just finds a war to fight in. Any war, by the way. And so among his many exploits, before he actually is responsible for basically the reorganization of Jamestown, he was reputed to have killed and beheaded 3 Turkish soldiers in personal combat. And apparently he so impressed his commander that the Prince of Transylvania knighted him. In other words, the descendants of Count Dracula were super impressed by Smith's combat skills. So what happens is eventually he is arrested and captured by the Turks. He, of course, escapes, travels through Poland and Lithuania to return to England in 1604. So this guy has basically fought his way around the world. And to be honest, characters like John Smith weren't uncommon. There was a lot of war going on during this time period, and John Smith kind of capitalizes on that. But then when he gets back in 1604, he basically works exclusively for the crown. He takes part in an earlier mapping expedition off the coast of what is present-day New England. And by the way, John Smith is the guy who who names New England, New England. But again, he arrives in the New World in chains. But once he gets there, he mandates a very strict policy where if you don't work, you don't eat. And a lot of the settlers didn't like that because it meant that they couldn't go off and find gold and that kind of thing. But as soon as John Smith takes command of the colony of Jamestown, basically the mortality rate levels off. Oh, I forgot to mention, John Smith negotiates a peace treaty with Powhatan, partially because even Powhatan kind of respects Smith. Smith sort of reorganizes the defenses. Smith is no dummy. He kind of knows what Powhatan is trying to do. And the whole thing where Pocahontas comes out and saves Smith from being executed, that's not really a thing. What kind of happens is that there is this ritual that is staged whereby Smith kind of submits himself before Powhatan. Powhatan's like, I could kill you, but I'm a super nice guy, so I won't. And that's kind of the way that works. So instead of being this spontaneous display of mercy and coming together, what actually happens is that it's all staged. Now, eventually, Smith is out, I think, scouting around the colony, where suddenly his gunpowder pouch spontaneously combusts. In other words, he gets blown up, but he gets better. So that scene at the end of the movie when John Smith is going back to England, no, he doesn't like get shot, or I can't remember how he gets injured, but yeah, he gets shot by the English guy. Didn't happen. What actually happens is he kind of gets blown up. But if you're John Smith, that doesn't apparently kill you. He goes back to England and actually lives for a while afterwards. So John Smith is one of those individuals who actually does pretty well. John Smith was not super popular back home in England. It's one of the reasons why he goes abroad and fights as a mercenary. You know, he's crude, he's kind of barbaric, but suddenly all of those traits, which were, barbaric and all that in polite company, suddenly they become very, very useful. You can kind of think of John Smith as almost like an English version of Cortez. And so, once again, we see an example of how individuals who break the rules or bend the rules sometimes do very, very well in the American colonies. And in fact, many of them are attracted to the colonies precisely because there are no rules. That being said, Smith saves the colony from destruction, but that doesn't mean that the colony is successful. Because if you remember, the colony was created by investors, and investors expect a return on investment, right? They expect to make some money out of it. And Jamestown has been an incredible disappointment if that's the case. So the problem is that you have this colony, and it apparently is going to stay around, but nobody really knows what to do with it. So it's a colony that has been created purely for the sake of making profit. There are no profits. It's also a colony it's almost exclusively male at this point. So that means that you don't have it's really not even that permanent of a settlement. There are no schools. There is no next generation waiting to take over. And so the population has to basically be replaced from England. Then what happens is that the colony gets a new arrival, and his name is John Rolfe. John Rolfe is, let's say, another kind of person who does very well in the New World. John Smith is very good at beating people up, right? John Smith is very good at, let's say, taking advantage of the fact that there are no rules. John Rolfe, however, is somebody who is very good at sensing new opportunities. John Rolfe and the ship that he was on basically has to stop over at an island in the Caribbean, and while he's there, he basically picks up a native, a little bit of tobacco there, and he takes it with him because he thinks it might be useful. So while or after he arrives, Um, John Rolfe is one of those individuals who doesn't work particularly hard, but he is very good at sensing an opportunity. So, just on a whim, he decides to see what happens if he plants tobacco in the very moist, marshy soil surrounding Jamestown. And lo and behold, it worked. Um, the fact, also, by the way, the fact that tobacco is super addictive also helped. So, starting around the year 1614, the economy of Jamestown begins repurposing itself to grow tobacco, assuming there was an economy in Jamestown before that, which I think is kind of a highly dubious notion. So, you can also see, by the way, that the growth of tobacco in Jamestown was super controversial. So I think that if you look at the primary source I attached to you, the king himself, King James, the guy they named the colony for, he was not a fan of tobacco, but he was a fan of the royal revenues that were coming in, and he couldn't really argue against that. So, most of you probably know, or some of you probably know, that in 1614, John Rolfe also marries Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter. And that means that relations between the colonists and the Native Americans are going to be peachy, right? And to be honest, if Disney kind of gave the full account, it would be super depressing, because what happens is that in 1625, Powhatan has been dead for, I think, a few years, but his brother basically takes control of his tribal confederation, and as the English population around Jamestown begins to stabilize and grow, basically Powhatan's confederation launches this overwhelming attack. Now, at first, the Native Americans are actually pretty successful. But what is a recurring pattern is that even though European colonists can sometimes be outfought, and very often they are. I mean, in most of the wars fought between white settlers and Native Americans, the Native Americans usually have the advantage at first. They know the terrain. They have an economy or a lifestyle that's based around hunting. They do pretty well militarily. But the problem is that the European colonists always have basically a wild card. And that wild card is that they always know that the mother country can bail them out. And that's what happens in 1625, where English forces come in and they help fend off the colony from attack. But the issue is that, remember, this colony, it was supposed to exist for the purpose of making money, making a profit. And now it's just fought a very long and devastating conflict. So the Virginia Company is now bankrupt. So what happens, not for the last time in American history, is that a leader decides that an American company is too big to fail, and King James decides to bail out the Virginia Company. Bailout is basically when, or in this case, the way I'm using bailout is when the government comes and takes over a corporation because of its debts. Now, what happens is that in 1625, this means that the Virginia Company has to disband, and it becomes a royal colony. And a royal colony is very different from a joint stock company. So remember, a joint stock company is governed by shareholders. A royal colony is a colony where a governor is appointed, and he basically rules on the king's behalf. But the problem is that just because you're a royal governor does not necessarily mean that you're always in the colony. It also doesn't mean that you necessarily know what you're doing. In fact, most royal governors really didn't. you want to be a royal governor not because you want to work your way up the ladder. It's not because this is kind of like a stepping stone in your political career. No, you want to be a royal governor because the perks are awesome. You get a nice paycheck, and you don't really have to do much. And a lot of times, the royal governors were kind of like the king's golfing buddies. So if you were friends with the king, you might become a royal governor, but it didn't necessarily mean that you knew what in the world you were doing. And some people took issue with that, like the colonists. And so what happens is that slowly but surely, the colony starts to meet, and decisions are made kind of as a group. And this leads to the establishment of what we call the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is basically a representative assembly, um, in which decisions are taken by representatives of the people. But keep in mind, the definition of people, unfortunately, in U.S. history is a tricky one. It's not necessarily intuitive. So, for example, in order to vote, you had to own land. And that's also going to be a feature of American history where generally voting rights were based on how much land you owned. And we'll also talk about how corruption was endemic in the House of Burgesses. And while it's theoretically a democracy on paper, it's not necessarily a democracy in practice. But, and this is a big picture point, so I want you guys to kind of pay attention to this. So, the House of Burgesses was created because the government wasn't doing its job. Royal governors weren't effectively running the colony. The investors in the joint stock company weren't effectively running the colony. So what happens is that these are colonists that are trying to improvise. So it's not the case, like maybe what you learn in civics, that you see these English colonists journeying to the New World in order to establish democracy. I mean, they're not thinking about democracy. They're thinking about this. They're thinking about tobacco and how to make a buck. But that being said, they have to turn to democracy just to get stuff done. It's kind of like when you have a problem within a family, or just any problem that involves more than one person. At a certain point, what happens is you just want to get everybody together so you can talk through the problem. I don't know if that's democracy, but I'm not sure if the House of Burgesses is really a democracy either. So what happens is that you have this unofficial government that is established that is supposed to get stuff done. Now, it never is given official permission or sanction by the crown. So technically, the House of Burgesses is not a legal government body, which is super awkward. But one of the things you kind of, that's maybe a feature of English government, is that generally the English just kind of go with it. They don't explicitly condone colonial legislatures like the House of Burgesses, but they don't overrule them either. But the House of Burgesses is the first of many colonial legislatures that we talk about. And this kind of sets a precedent for these colonial assemblies to basically do the job of government in spite of their lack of legitimacy. But governments wouldn't really matter unless Jamestown was successful, and it was. You can kind of detect this based upon the amount of tobacco that's actually produced. So you guys can read, obviously, but just look at this difference. You have 20,000 pounds of the stuff grown in 1617, and then by the beginning of the 18th century, by 1700, you have 30 million pounds of tobacco grown in the Chesapeake. I mean, it's just an extraordinary amount of money that we're talking about. Um, and by the way, tobacco at this point was a luxury item. And if you wanted to advertise the fact that you were a noble, or you just had money, then smoking a cigarette or a cigar or a pipe became kind of a symbol of your status as an elite upper class person. Um, so the question is, how are you going to grow all this stuff? Because tobacco, from what I understand, I've never grown tobacco. Um, it's kind of, and by the way, I've never really grown anything before. One of the difficulties of this course is that so much of the early stuff is um, about farming, and I feel totally unqualified to talk about it because I am one of those individuals who, I'm lucky if I touch my house plants. I'm lucky if they survive, let alone, something that is being grown for consumption. But apparently, tobacco is very picky and requires a lot of care and tending. And so you need a lot of manpower that you don't necessarily have. And remember that the problem with manpower is that Jamestown itself is still really dangerous. Roughly, I mean, remember, we started with a 90% fatality rate. Well, things have got better, by about the 1620s or 1630s. The mortality rate is only about 40 or 50%. So only half of new arrivals die within a few years. So the problem is, how do you get people to want to do that? I mean, you can lie to them and say, yeah, go to Jamestown, it'll be all right. But at the same time, once they get there, I mean, they're going to pick up on the fact that life is not exactly great. So you might have to pay these people a fortune to work on tobacco farms and help cultivate tobacco plants. Now, I know that at least one person, or at least probably more than, probably several of you, are thinking, this is where slavery comes in. So the answer is yes, but also no. The reason I say yes is that the first slave, at least to an English colony in the New World, was brought to Jamestown in the year 1619. I think about 20 African slaves are imported into the colony. But as a historian, we also have to be careful about what we mean by the term slave. Because remember, there's old world slavery and there's new world slavery. And I mentioned that there is this slow transition from old world slavery to new world slavery. I'll just go ahead and give you tell you that New World chattel slavery really begins in English North America, probably in the second half of the 17th century, so really beyond the year 1650. What we see with the slaves brought to Jamestown is that they're more like old world slaves, or almost, and in fact, there's a debate as to whether or not they were slaves or indentured servants. So we've talked a lot about slavery in the last couple of lessons, but at the same time, the growth of slavery is an organic process. And partially, if you think about it, slavery is really expensive. Slaves are really expensive. And so if it is the case that chattel slavery is let's say adopted in Jamestown, what does that mean if, for example, 50% of newcomers die? And by the way, 50% of newcomers die because even in the best case scenario, even if there's good food, even if they don't die from a Native American attack, the fact is that people's immune systems just aren't exactly adapted to the types of diseases that you contract in the New World. So the price of a slave, or sorry, the life expectancy of a slave was built into the price. So what that means in practice is, let's say that somebody cruelly guesses that this slave probably has 30 to 40 years worth of labor. Well, that means that in the really inhumane economics of slavery, they would price the slave accordingly. They would price the slave based on the idea that somebody could get 30 to 40 years of labor out of them. Well, what does that mean if you lose them after a year or two? So it's not the reason that you don't see chattel slavery, let's say on a widespread basis in Virginia, isn't because like the Virginians, or let's be specific, the residents of Jamestown are kinder, gentler people than, let's say, the Portuguese colonists. It's just that you don't have an economic system that can support chattel slavery. It's it's a profit-losing enterprise. Portugal has slavery in Brazil, and that seems to make money, but it wouldn't in Jamestown. Not yet. Not with the huge mortality rate. And part of that is because tobacco is profitable, but not nearly as profitable as crops like sugar. So you don't see chattel slavery just yet. Instead, what you see is this, indentured servitude. So let me go ahead and put down some terms. I hate those sound effects. Sorry. So indentured servitude is basically a system in which a servant signs a contract and agrees to work for a master for a period of years. It's not exactly slavery, though in some cases it can seem like slavery. I've heard a few stories, or let's say a few arguments, that the English use Irish slaves, and they weren't really slaves; they were indentured servants. And indentured servitude could still be horrific, but there are some really critical differences between indentured servants and slaves. One is that indentured servants weren't servants on the basis of color. There were white European indentured servants. There were African indentured servants. It's not servitude based upon color or race. It's servitude based upon contract. And actually, that is what indentured servitude means, or indenture means. An indenture is a labor contract. And the thing is that, if you're a law student, maybe you kind of know this, a contract requires two parties to agree to the terms of the contract, and it requires two parties that have standing under the law. That means that they're considered adult human beings, right? Well, the thing is that chattel slavery operates under the idea that a slave isn't a person, they're property. So indentured servitude doesn't assume that a servant is a non-person. There were, in the contract, it was spelled out what masters would do and what servants would do. And usually servants would agree to work for a period of 7 years. After the end of those 7 years, a servant would reasonably expect to get some money, maybe some seed or tools, and maybe a little bit of land. And the masters would usually, and this was also really important, pay for the transportation of the servant overseas. So this system is called the headright system. The headright system, in some respects, was a scam because all life in the Chesapeake revolved around one single truth. And that truth is that 1 out of every 2 immigrants would die within a few years of their arrival into the New World, right? So the thing is that if you are an employer or a master, and you know that you only actually have to provide for 1 out of every 2 indentured servants because half of them are going to die, then again, the cruel economics of New World labor means that this is actually a good thing for you. Because if the servants die before their contract is up, well, you don't have to give them anything. Um, so, but if you did manage to survive, which, by the way, was pretty tricky, right? But if you did manage to survive, then it wasn't a terrible bargain because you did get a little bit of land usually, and it was a good way for members of the lower class to actually become members of the middle class, and in some cases, upper class. Most of the let's say the indentured servants we're talking about, usually they were people who lived in cities. And this was kind of the government's way, the English government's way, of taking care of, quote, the surplus population. And the English were very, let's say that this is kind of an almost uniquely English institution because the English do this all the time. They do this with the United States. And I don't know, maybe you've heard about Australia. They basically use that same system to colonize the rest of their empire. So for example, in the New World, as well as Australia and other parts of the empire, indentured servants were usually people who were debtors who may be or who would otherwise be imprisoned. So at that point, I guess your judge or magistrate would say, all right, you've got two choices. You can either go to prison for having the audacity of losing your job and your home, or you can go to the New World and try your luck there. So prison, freedom, prison, freedom. You can kind of guess which choice most people made. But again, it was a risky choice because of the high fatality rates. We should point out that even with the large population of indentured servants arriving, most of these indentured servants were young, unattached males. People who were kind of at the stage of their life where they can afford to take a few risks because they don't really have very many responsibilities. And so because of that, the Chesapeake was a place to work. It wasn't really a place to live. You don't really see schools. You don't see, you see some churches, but there aren't very many amenities that suggest that this is going to be a place to raise families or maybe even create a society. This is really just a place for people to work. And you can kind of get a sense for this in the fact that even though women could also be indentured servants, only about 1 in 4 indentured servants were women. So what this kind of means is that in some respects for women, this was actually a chance for them to kind of climb up the ladder because women had all kinds of legal obstacles in British and American law. They couldn't vote. In most cases, they really couldn't own property. But in, let's say, most of European history, unfortunately, if you want to climb up the ladder and achieve social mobility, for women, you don't have as many options open to you as men do. So the only real option you have is marrying well. Now, if you look at the demography of Jamestown, demography means that if you look at basically the distribution of the population, if 1 out of 4 people are women, it means that women could kind of be picky and choosy about who they marry. So it means that for women as well as for men, there were some opportunities to climb up the social ladder, but the trick is you had to survive. And the high mortality rate meant that, to a certain extent, indentured servants did have some bargaining power. So because of the fact that it was hard to find labor, it took a lot of time to transport, and also because of the fact that masters wanted to make sure that their tobacco plantations were as productive as possible. Let's just say that masters knew that even though they were entitled to punish servants, they generally hesitated doing so because some of the earliest court cases we have in Virginia involve disputes between masters because one master took another master's servant. Usually there are cases like a servant running away from a very cruel master, and then the servant finds another master who's nicer to them. So, yeah, you could go to court to actually get a judge to order the return of the servant, but that took a lot of time. It was expensive. Nobody had time for that. So generally what happened is that masters and servants kind of developed almost like this uneasy truce. Servants weren't nearly as productive as they could be, but at the same time, masters consoled themselves with the fact that it was still mostly free labor.